Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm your narrator Giles with a J and we're on Season 22, Family Annihilators Part 2. I already did a season of Family Annihilators years ago and you can check the description for a link to a playlist of all of those videos. Otherwise, on with the show. Christmas is supposed to be a time of celebration. A happy time where families come together and enjoy each other's company. Though money was usually tight as pre-Depression era tobacco farmers, the Lawson family still had happy Christmases, making do with whatever they could. It was just before Christmas of 1929 that the family patriarch Charles Lawson announced that he had a surprise for the family that year. And a surprise it was, something that came as a shock to his family and everyone else they knew. This is Monsters. Charles Lawson was born on May 10, 1886 in North Carolina. His family were rural tobacco farmers and Charles continued that tradition as he became an adult. Charles met Fanny Mannering in the fall of 1910 and they got married on March 12, 1911. Soon, Fanny was pregnant with the first of 8 children she and Charlie would have together. The following year, Charles's younger brother Marion would marry Jetty Ashby and the couple would be a consistent part of the other Lawson family's lives. The two families' lives would run fairly parallel over the years as they both had a number of children and worked on tobacco farms. Marion and Jetty had moved to Germantown, North Carolina after they married to work a farm there. The land was good and level and made for better farming than where they were from. Charles made an agreement to purchase a 40-acre or 16-hectare tract of farmland for $1,500, about $3,200 today. They loaded up a covered wagon and made the journey from Lawsonville to Germantown in the fall of 1918. By then they had 4 children. Arthur was born in 1912, Marie in 1913, William in 1914, and Carrie was the baby, having been born just over a year before the move. A neighbor from their new farm traveled the 20 miles or 32 kilometers north to Lawsonville with his wagon to help the family move. The children and some lighter housewares were in Charles's wagon, and the heavier items like furniture were in the other wagon. They left early one morning, stopped to sleep during the trip, and then made it to the property the following day. Once there, they didn't have a house on the land they purchased, so they moved into a rented house on a neighboring property. With the end of the year approaching, the Lawsons got settled into their home and made preparations to make it through the winter. In January of 1919, Charles came down with an unknown illness that left him in pain with symptoms that resembled arthritis. While he was bedridden, his father Gus came down with a cold that developed into pneumonia. Charles got the news that his father had died on February 22nd, but he was too sick to make the trip back to Lawsonville to attend the funeral. That was a huge loss for Charles, but the biggest concern was if he would be able to recover enough to start working the farm when spring arrived. Unfortunately, it seemed that he struggled that year and was unable to make the agreed-upon payment for the land he had purchased. The property reverted back to its original owner, and Charles began working as a sharecropper on the property their rented cabin was on. There was a span of 6 years after Carrie was born that the Lawsons didn't have another child. They still had 4 children on November 10, 1920, when they celebrated William's 6th birthday. The boy came down with a bad cold on his birthday, and it progressively got worse over the days that followed. Over the weekend of November 13th and 14th, William developed a fever and was only getting worse. On Monday morning, Charles traveled 6 miles or 9.5 kilometers to the nearby town of Walnut Cove and found the local doctor. It was late in the day by the time they made it to the Lawsons' cabin, and William was even worse. The doctor determined that he had come down with pneumonia and gave him a high dose of vitamin A, which was considered the latest and greatest treatment for pneumonia at the time. I could only find opposing opinions on the effectiveness as it's considered today. With that diagnosis and treatment plan, the doctor told the parents that it didn't look good. They continued with the treatment throughout the following day, but on the 16th, William succumbed to his illness. The family was able to mourn William's death over the winter and were back out in the fields come spring to continue farming tobacco. In 1922, the family moved to another farm in Germantown. Like before, they rented a house and farmed a portion of land for a share of the crop. That house was even closer to Charles's brother Marion and his family. Fanny and the children were able to walk to their house and visit with their relatives. They had their fifth child, Mabel, that spring, but in those days child mortality was much higher than it is now. In November, one of Charles's nieces burned to death after having something from the fireplace fall onto her. Then Marion's youngest child, 10-month-old Chester, got sick and suddenly stopped breathing. He died in late 1922 or early 1923. Throughout the 20s, the Lawson brothers would move farms and continue adding to their families. Marion and Hattie had a son named Eugene in 1924. Charles and Fanny had a son named James in 1925, and then another one named Raymond in 1927. In April of that year, Charlie purchased a farm on Brook Cove Road for $3,200. He was able to get a bank loan for that amount with annual payments of $500 until the loan was paid off. The land was good and there was already outbuildings in great shape, but the house itself was not ready to be lived in. After the purchase was complete, Charles and Fanny got to work updating the log cabin and making it at least comfortable for the time being. Once they were moved, Charles planned on building them a new house on the property and they would all just have to make do until then. During the summer, the tobacco crop was growing and Charles was continuing to make improvements to the farm. An important aspect of the farm was a storehouse for the tobacco after it was harvested. It needed to be the correct humidity to allow the tobacco to dry just the right amount. Well, the storehouse had not been used in some time before he bought the property, so the drainage ditch inside had become clogged with weeds. Charles was using a pickaxe to break up the dirt in the ditch when the tool got caught up on a wire. When it was released, the pickaxe flew back and hit Charles in the forehead. Charles had not lost consciousness, which is a good sign for a head injury. Still, he went into town and saw the local doctor just in case. The doctor said it looked worse than it was. There was a bleeding wound on his scalp and one side of his face turned black and blue, but he seemed to have escaped any serious injury and was able to continue working the farm. The first year of owning his own farm, Charles was able to bring a very respectable crop to market in Winston-Salem, where he made a comfortable profit. The Lawsons spent years successfully working the farm, but tragedy continued to strike. In April of 1928, Jettie Lawson went into early labor with her last child. The local doctor rushed to the house, but it was unfortunately a deadly time for women and infants. The doctor determined that the baby wasn't in the correct position to be born, so he reached inside of Jettie and manually turned the baby. Marion would later say that he thought the doctor had been drinking and that he never saw him wash his hands before he turned the baby. Eventually, the baby Haley was born about a month premature. Unsurprisingly, Jettie got an infection and her condition deteriorated. When she came down with a fever, the doctor suggested they sweat the sickness out of her. They surrounded her with hot corn cobs and covered her with blankets. Of course, we know now that that method is not helpful to someone with a fever, and this case was no different. Jettie continued to get worse, and on May 1st, she finally succumbed to her illness. Baby Haley was taken in by Charles and Marion's sister-in-law, who had just lost twins of her own. It wasn't long before Haley returned to her father and siblings, but after arriving home, she fell ill and died a few days later. Marion and his family did the best they could, with Stella stepping in to help raise the children. She was only 13 years old, but as the oldest girl, she was expected to pick up the maternal slack. Ever since Charles had been struck in the head with the pickaxe, he was suffering from headaches. He was known to have a short temper, and the headaches only made it worse. On top of that, people who knew Charles said he started acting strange. He always seemed troubled, and he would stare off into the distance. Once he was in the middle of a conversation with his brother Marion when he just turned and walked away. Fanny told others that Charles wasn't sleeping. Once she found him sitting in the cornfield in the cold, praying, holding his shotgun. She convinced him to go back into the house. In August of 1929, Fanny gave birth to their last child, Mary Lou. In the months that followed, Charles's behavior became even more erratic. Fanny would find him up in the middle of the night cleaning his guns. It was said that Arthur would sleep in his clothes in case he needed to get up at night due to a problem, but I couldn't find any examples of what those problems might have been. Fanny had said that Charles would sit in his favorite chair near the fire with his guns on the wall nearby. He would suddenly jump up, grab a rifle, and sight down the barrel out the front window. He was repeatedly checking on the guns and his ability to react with them. He would clean them over and over again, obsessing over if anyone else had used them, but nobody knew why. Arthur had his own guns, and everybody knew not to touch their father's guns. As Christmas of 1929 approached, Fanny asked Charles about gifts for the children. They hadn't always been able to afford to get the kids presents, but their farm was doing well, so Fanny asked her husband if they would be able to afford it that year. He responded that he had a surprise for the family and he was taking care of it. About a week and a half before Christmas, he announced that he was taking everyone into the city to each get a new set of clothes, and then they were going to get a family portrait. That was a big undertaking in 1929. Getting 9 people 13 miles or 20 kilometers away to Winston-Salem all at the same time wasn't easy. Charles, Fanny holding the baby, James and Raymond squeezed into the cab while the other 3 children would have to ride in the back of Charles's truck for 45 minutes in December, so the trip was a big deal to say the least. When they arrived, they stopped into a clothing store and each picked out a brand new outfit. Fanny was concerned about how much it would cost, but Charles told her it was no problem. He said he had the money for it. The family bagged up the clothes they had worn into the store and headed to a photography studio to have a family portrait taken. They all changed back into their old clothes for the long journey back to the farm, where they completed their chores and ate dinner. Fanny had no idea that Charles had been planning the trip, so she thought it must have been the surprise he had been talking about. It was a surprise, but it turned out that Charles had something even more shocking in store. The winter of 1929 was a cold one. There was heavy snowfall in the days leading up to Christmas. Despite there being no crops, there was still a lot of chores on the farm. Charles maintained the farm so it would be ready for spring and made sure he had supplies to keep the family warm through winter. He and Arthur also regularly hunted rabbits to keep the family in fresh meat for their meals. Christmas morning was no different. Charles got up and did the morning chores. Everyone said he seemed pretty normal, which by then might have actually been unusual. Arthur and some friends went out hunting rabbits and then had a shooting contest. They would throw an old can into the air and see who could put the most holes in it before it hit the ground. Marie was baking a cake to have with Christmas dinner. When Arthur and his friends started running low on ammunition, Arthur went into the house and asked his father if he could borrow some. Charles said he was also running low and everyone wanted to do some hunting later that day, so he suggested the teenagers walk into Germantown to pick up some more. Arthur and his buddies headed out of the house and trekked down the railroad tracks through the snow and into town. It seemed that Charles was not only suffering ill effects from his head injury, but he was losing control of his family. For a strict man with a short temper, that was likely not making his outlook on life positive. When he came into the house after doing his morning chores, he saw Marie standing in front of her mirror getting fixed up with hair curlers and makeup. When he asked her what she was doing, she told him she was going to the church Christmas party and that a boy she liked was going to be there. Well, apparently Charles wasn't a fan of that boy and he told Marie that she couldn't go. Marie, who was 17 years old at the time, told her father that she was going and that he couldn't stop her. That seemed to be the final straw for Charles. In spring of that year, Arthur had also stood up to him while working in the fields. Charles believed that Arthur wasn't doing a good job with the cultivator and was giving him a piece of his mind. When Arthur stood up for himself, which was seen as talking back to Charles, the father grabbed a young sapling and threatened his son with a whipping. Arthur, at 19 years old, was having none of it. When Charles swung the switch, Arthur grabbed it and broke it over his knee. Arthur told his father that he wasn't going to whip him and that he would never be man enough to whip him ever again. That was a strong blow to a proud traditional man in the early 20th century. It was the first sign that he was losing control of his family, and then Marie's defiance just compounded it. Charles picked up his rifle and shotgun and walked out of the house. He went into the tobacco barn and grabbed another shotgun he had hidden there sometime prior. He hid behind the barn and waited for two of his daughters to leave the house. They had been getting ready to walk to their uncle's house nearby, and Charles decided they would be the first victims in his plan to annihilate his family. As Carrie and Mabel approached the barn, Charles stepped out and pointed his rifle at them. A neighbor later said she thought she heard a girl yell, quote, "Papa, don't shoot us," before a pop rang in the air. He fired around at Carrie first, and she must have realized what was going on at the last minute because she raised her hand in front of her face. The bullet went through her hand and into her head, killing the 12-year-old. Mabel turned and ran, and Charles tried to fire around at her, but the rifle jammed. He immediately switched to a shotgun and hit her in the left side of her back. The shot destroyed one lung, killing the 7-year-old. Other people in the area heard the shots, but of course, at the time it wasn't unusual to hear gunshots in the area. People in the area were regularly hunting for small game, so there was no reason to think anything bad was happening. Charles was taking no chances at leaving any of his victims alive. He picked up a large stick that was propped up beside the barn and beat both girls on the head repeatedly until he was certain they couldn't survive. Then he dragged each of their bodies into the tobacco farm, placed a rock under their heads, and folded their arms across their chests. As he was coming out of the barn, Fanny had stepped out onto the porch to grab some more wood for the stove. With an armload of wood, she noticed that Charles was raising a shotgun to aim right at her, so she turned to run back into the house, but it was too late. A shotgun blast entered her body and destroyed half of her heart, leaving a gaping hole in her. That shot was much closer to the house, and it startled Marie enough that she ran to look out the front window. From that vantage point, she couldn't see what was going on outside, so she opened the front door to see her father dragging her mother's body across the front porch, chunks of firewood scattered around her. She screamed as reported by neighbors. Some boys who were playing catch nearby ran to the house to investigate the commotion. They entered the back door of the house and saw Charles drag Fanny's body completely into the house through the front door and close the door behind him. Marie was still screaming about the murder of her mother by her father. Marie finally stood and went for the fireplace poker while Charles was reloading the shotgun, but she wouldn't make it in time. She was shot at close range in the back, and the force pushed her forward so hard that her face hit the fireplace mantel and snapped her neck as it whipped her head back. Charles looked right at the boy in the back door and he ran off. Then the father took the butt of his shotgun and beat Marie's head until he was sure she was dead. By then, 4-year-old James and 2-year-old Raymond had witnessed the ongoing slaughter and had found hiding places. Charles found Raymond hiding behind the stove, and he tried to use the shotgun as leverage to move the heavy stove, but it only bent the weapon's barrel. When he was able to pull the toddler out from behind the stove, he didn't shoot him. He used the butt of the shotgun stock to beat him to death. He found James hiding under a bed and murdered him the same way he had dispatched Raymond. The last victim was baby Mary Lou. She only got to live for about 4 months before her father murdered her in cold blood. Charles walked around the blood-spattered house and put pillows under his victims' heads and crossed their arms across their chests. He left the damaged double-barrel shotgun and replaced it with a single barrel. He also picked up the rifle that had jammed. While Charles was still inside, his brother Elijah, the uncle Carrie and Mabel were going to visit, arrived at his house. Elijah and his son had been out rabbit hunting and they decided to stop by to say hi. He had no idea that his two nieces had already left for his house but had never made it. They tried to open the front door, but something was in the way. They didn't know it was Fanny's dead body. Elijah looked in through a window and saw blood and bodies. They tried to open the front door again, but then they heard movement upstairs, so they ran off to get help. As far as they knew, someone had killed the family and they were still in the house. As they ran off, Elijah's son Claude gazed back at the house and saw the figure of a man standing in the upstairs window. To be fair, they would have confronted the man themselves, but they had run out of ammunition while hunting, so they had no good way of defending themselves against an armed intruder. They ran towards a neighboring farm and began shouting for help. When they got no response, they ended up running back to their own house so Elijah could restock his ammo and return to the scene. While that was going on, a local man named Stephen Hampton received word that there had been an incident at Charles Lawson's house. They were one of the few families in the area with a telephone, and back then it was still set up as a party line. The same line was used by multiple people in the area. When Stephen's daughter picked up the phone to use it that day, someone was already on the line reporting that someone was injured at the Lawson home. When Stephen heard that, he grabbed his rifle and set out towards the scene. When he got to the property, he saw two pools of blood in the snow near the tobacco barn and blood trails that led into the barn. Before he opened the door, Sheriff's Deputy Robert Walker arrived on the scene with a few other people. They opened the door to the barn where they found the bodies of Carrie and Mabel. By the time people arrived at the house, armed and ready to investigate, Charles had fled. He ran into a wooded area behind the tobacco barn. He walked through the woods, his two hunting dogs at his side, until he reached a creek. His path would later be tracked to the creek where it's believed he washed the blood from his hands. He finally made it to another patch of woods where he sat down next to a tree. It's believed he spent time trying to unjam his rifle, but his hands were likely too cold to be able to navigate the parts. He found a small stick that he could use to push the trigger of the shotgun as he held it between his feet and aimed it at his heart. He tested that it would work, but he wasn't able to bring himself to pull the trigger. He pulled a pencil out of his coat pocket and started writing a note on the back of a tobacco market receipt. It read, quote, "Troubles can cause," but it seemed he changed his mind. He put that paper back in his pocket, pulled out another receipt and wrote, quote, "No one to blame but..." Again, he didn't finish the note and put both the paper and pencil back in his pocket. It's unknown what Charles did next while sitting against that tree. A number of burnt-out matchsticks showed that he might have lit them to try and warm his hands and face. It's believed that he sat there for hours before finally shooting himself. While people were at the scene investigating and recovering bodies, a few heard a single gunshot from the woods, and then Charles's dogs came running onto the property towards them. It was believed that that was the end of Charles's life. When people on the scene learned that Arthur and some friends had walked to town, one of them sent their son to find them. Arthur ran back on the property and pushed his way towards the front door of the house. It wouldn't open much, but he could see his mother's feet on the floor and he collapsed in tears. His uncle Elijah had to break the news that his entire family was dead and that his father had killed them. Marion and Stella arrived on the scene and they learned the horrible news. They did their best to comfort Arthur, but there wasn't much comfort to be found. The sheriff arrived on the scene and he and the deputy entered the house through the back door. They surveyed the carnage, but it struck them that Charles might still be upstairs. Not brave enough to go check, they left the house. When the coroner arrived, they told him they couldn't go upstairs because if Charles was there, he could easily blow their heads off. Which was true, but it was kind of their job. Still, the doctor ended up volunteering to go check. He said he'd had a good life and he didn't think Charles would shoot him anyway. In the end, Charles wasn't there as he had already fled into the woods. As the coroner examined the bodies in the house, others were securing the scene outside. As they were keeping watch while the bodies were being recovered from the barn, Stephen Hampton and a few other men heard the gunshot in the woods and saw the dogs. Once the dogs made it to them, they almost immediately started back towards the woods as if they wanted the men to follow, which they did. They had a pretty good idea of what they were going to find. When they got to the spot, the dogs laid faithfully at each side of Charles's body. He was laying on his back with a large wound in his chest. He was so fresh that the warm blood was creating steam as it met the frigid air. Charles Lawson was dead, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind that he was the one who had murdered his family. The witness, along with the evidence, would prove that to be true. The only thing that people had to wonder about was why. There were a number of factors that could have led to Charles's decision to murder his family. Of course, the head injury was what most people believed was the cause. During Charles's autopsy, a doctor from Johns Hopkins University removed Charles's brain and took it back to the university to study it. They found no sign of damage to the area where Charles had suffered his head injury, but they did find a spot in the center of his brain that was less developed than the surrounding tissue. Of course, the brain is an important factor in anyone's actions, and though the doctor at Johns Hopkins believed the underdeveloped spot in Charles's brain could have contributed to the murder, it's impossible to know for sure. Also, mental illness is likely a factor, but it wouldn't have been an avenue the doctors would have taken. Mental illness wasn't something that was considered unless there were major signs. At that point, there weren't many effective treatments, and most people suffering with mental illness were institutionalized indefinitely. Obviously, the time Fanny found Charles outside in the middle of the night, praying and clutching his shotgun, were signs that something was wrong. But that wasn't the only example. One of the Lawsons' friends died in December of 1929, and they attended her wake on the 18th. As a group of people were huddled together in the cold talking about life and death, Charles was overheard saying, quote, "I wouldn't mind dying, but I would want to take my family with me." It was a scary prediction that would soon become a reality, but nobody at the time had any reason to believe Charles was going to slaughter his whole family. The most controversial reason that's come up as a reason Charles murdered his family was to cover up the incestuous relationship he was having with his daughter Marie. There were rumors swirling that Marie was pregnant at the time of her death and that it was Charles who was the father. It was eventually uncovered that those rumors were true based on statements made by Marie's close friend Ella Mae Johnson. About 2 weeks before Christmas of 1929, Marie was sleeping over at Ella Mae's house when her friend noticed that she was being unusually quiet. When Ella Mae asked her what was wrong, Marie hesitated before finally admitting that she was pregnant. When Ella Mae pressed about who the father was, Marie said that it was her papa's baby. It's believed that Marie was able to confide in Ella Mae because she had shared a similar secret the previous year. Ella Mae had been sexually assaulted by her own father and was able to talk to Marie about it, so Marie felt like she would understand her problem. Marie went on to tell her that her mother had noticed that she had missed her period for a few months, and she finally told Fanny that it was Papa's baby. Then she said that Charles also knew but didn't know that Fanny knew. He said that if she told anyone, especially her mama, there would be some killing done. During the last few weeks of the Lawsons' lives, it's unclear what was known by the other family members. Did Fanny confront Charles, which pushed him to murder his family to keep the secret? It's unknown, but it certainly could have been a factor, especially after Charles found his daughter getting fixed up to see a boy. What would happen when he learned she was pregnant? The walls were closing in on Charles, and along with undiagnosed mental illness and a possible brain abnormality, it could have been the perfect storm that set Charles on a path to family annihilation. But why had he spared Arthur? Nobody knows. Maybe he wanted someone left to carry on the family name. Since it seemed like he had been planning the murders ahead of time, maybe he thought Arthur and his friends would be able to stop him, so he found a reason to send them away. It's also possible that, despite having something of a plan, he just became enraged by Marie and set off on his killing spree without caring that Arthur wasn't there. Arthur had trouble escaping the stigma of his father's actions. He proposed to the girl he had been dating at the time of the murders, but her father was afraid he had inherited Charles's madness and forbade them from seeing each other. He eventually met and married a woman named Nina Bybee, and they had 4 children together: Nancy, Patsy, Mabel, and James. It was a home full of tension due to the trauma that Arthur had experienced, but it was said he loved his children, with some speculating that he saw his younger siblings in them. Unfortunately, though Arthur survived the mass murder of his family, he wouldn't be long for this world. On May 5, 1945, Arthur and a friend, Blaine Nelson, left a local tavern at 10:30 p.m. They had been drinking, though Blaine later said that Arthur didn't seem like he had consumed enough alcohol to be drunk. That observation would be proven wrong when Arthur missed a warning that the road was incomplete and crashed through a barricade. The truck flipped onto its side, which threw Arthur out of the cab, then it rolled over, coming to a stop right on top of the young man. Blaine was thrown from the cab as well, but landed clear of the truck. He suffered a laceration to his head and internal injuries. He said that a woman in another vehicle stopped just after the accident and held the wound on his head closed until help arrived. He said he never knew her name, but he believed she had saved his life. He was rushed to the hospital in Winston-Salem, where he recovered from his wounds. Arthur was not so lucky. When the truck was finally lifted off of him, people said he sucked in a full breath and died. He was 31 years old. With Arthur dead and none of his immediate family alive, Nina and the 4 children moved to California to get away from the Lawson family massacre and to start over. They did not stay in touch with Arthur's extended family, and little is known about what happened to them, though there is one report from a great-grandchild of Arthur's that everyone was doing well, but requested that their privacy be respected. There is a myth that John Dillinger actually murdered the Lawson family, but there's no truth to it. John Dillinger was arrested and sent to prison in Indiana on September 16, 1924, and he wasn't released until May 10, 1933, so even if the evidence didn't thoroughly point to Charles, Dillinger would not have been able to murder the Lawsons in December of 1929. Though it will never be known for sure what triggered Charles Lawson to want to end the lives of almost everyone in his immediate family, we do know that no matter the reason, he was definitely a monster. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.